Many thanks for joining. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa program, and I'm your host, Phantom Belede. Today, I'm joined by Professor Charles Musiba, Professor of Anthropology at University of Colorado, Denver, and board member of the World Heritage in USA. Professor, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you a lot, and
Who
I'm
is,
glad to be here with you.
who is Professor Charles? Would you introduce yourself and tell our audience your background and area of expertise, please?
Sure, that's wonderful. I'm Dr. Charles Msiba. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado, Denver. But I'm a Tanzanian by nation, a Tanzanian national, and I live here in the diaspora in the US in Colorado, Denver. And I'm originally from the Lake Victoria zone in Tanzania. And I worked for about 20 years in the Tanzanian government, various positions, Minister of Education, and also worked in the Minister of Natural Resources and Tourism before I actually joined the University of Colorado.
Africa has been considered as center of war and instability for a long period of time. How can this generation build a peaceful and stable Africa?
Well, you have a wonderful question. That question is it's a question I've been asking myself. The reason I've been asking this question myself is twofold. One is my own experience growing up on the shores of Lake Victoria. You may probably not remember, but in the 1960s, the very first human massacre, which happened in Rwanda, my family hosted 3 young men from Rwanda who lived with us for 3 years in my home. So, and as you can tell, it was the Hutu versus the Tutsi. But really, if you think about it, both they speak the same language. Both they're the same people, right? They live in Rwanda. But how did it happen that 2 different ethnic groups in this wonderful country, like Rwanda, for instance, they could just kill each other in the name of politics and power? Of course, that brings us back to one thing: the colonial legacy, for instance. For Rwanda, it was the colonial legacy. Divide and rule, give one particular group more power and pit it against the other one. That's how the game it was. Today, as we talk about it, we think about Africa's problems in terms of war. Those problems are not just isolated. They don't appear in a vacuum. These are problems which actually either they are intertwined with natural resources, with a lot of other accessibility to raw material which the West, for instance, in this case, may need. Look at Congo, one of the most richest countries in the world, right? It has got almost everything. But Congo has never been peaceful. Can you imagine if Congo today it was peaceful and developed? It threatens a lot of people, the existence of the West. The global North relies heavily on Africa, and they know that Africa is the final frontier. So, of course, we can talk about wars. We shouldn't be talking about wars in Africa out of the vacuum. They have to be a context. In the context, it's always been natural resources. And Africa has it all. Unfortunately, we have some problems. And those problems are actually sort of problems in which we have some political systems sometimes which were actually planted to us. A lot of Africa, as an anthropologist, I can tell you, we have the great kingdoms in Africa before the colonial encounter. In Ethiopia, you go to Lalibela, you can see some of this evidence. For instance, you go to Zimbabwe, you can see all this. You go to South Africa, you go everywhere, you can see all of this. So the fact is that we have had for years And we still not necessarily asking ourselves, why are we actually in constant influx of wars in Africa? And the answer to me is that because war is a big business. Who benefits from war when Africans kill each other? It's not the Africans. It's the global north, the people who sell us guns. They would sell us guns on one side, pit against the other. And we see it happening over and over again. And it's such unfortunate that most of us don't see that way. But it is a huge problem. And your question makes me wonder all the time, when will we wake up and start to think about this even more seriously? For whose benefit, anyway, are we fighting for? It's not to the people we killed who are brothers and sisters, right? And it's not because of the political gains or whatever. So it's just about resources. That's all what it is.
Western media have been reporting false narratives about Africa and its history. How can we counter such media threat from our continent?
First of all, we need to start to think. About when Western media, or global North in this case, not only just Western media, the global North, as I would call it, when they start saying things about Africa, it's always in a negative way, because they control the narrative. The narrative is not to inform the global North about Africa, but it's actually to dehumanize Africa as a continent. Basically, pity Africans and make sure that the global North can actually sort of start having a pity about Africans and say, look at that hopeless continent. And I don't know if you have ever read a book called The White Man's Burden. Africa is the white man's burden. And in that colonial legacy is still there. And now, even though African countries have actually they are free, they have their own government, they have their own freedom and all that, but the narrative is about the economy. You control the narrative that Africa is a hopeless place, right? Africa is a place in which there is no future except for misery and all that. And both the business, as a business model, Africa is a place where people make money. You can make money by actually showing that negative narrative. I can give you an example, in which you may not necessarily remember, but remember the One World attempt to actually feed Africa, Ethiopia, Bob Geldof, way back after the first war in Ethiopia and the famine. Do you believe, or can you believe, that the money which was actually collected in the West, only 10%, maybe 10 to 15%, made it to Ethiopia? Where did the other 85% go to? It's a big business. So you look at it, people who control the narrative about the misery of Africa, they have their own reasons. They do it because it's a business. If it's a news channel or a television, their viewership go up, their rating go up, because they're like, oh, look, we are giving you the stories, breaking the stories about Africa. Have you ever seen any story about Africa from the global North talking about the positive things about, for instance, you just built a high-speed rail in Ethiopia. Have you heard the global North talk about it? If they talk about it in a very negative way. They talk about it about, the Chinese, the Chinese are colonizing Ethiopia. The Chinese are colonizing Africa. But you never hear anything about the infrastructure. The Chinese are building high-speed trains in England. Nobody talks about it, right? It's okay. But when it happens in Africa, it has to be in a very negative spin. So it's who controls the narrative. And the biggest question now is, what do we do as Africans to counter that? And to remind people, I always say that we don't have to overreact. What we need to do is to actually start developing our own narrative and start actually working on actually making sure that what we want to show the West, what we want to show the global North, is about Africa by Africans. Yes, we may not have the biggest skyscrapers, but we do have the infrastructures. Our people are very happy. Our people are not going hungry. Look, I live in Colorado, and I can tell you, I walk to go to my work. I see people homeless. In the winter, people are dying in a country which is actually one of the most economic giant in the world. You have homelessness people who are say unhoused. Now they change the term. They say they're unhoused people without homes, right? Have you ever seen it on the television, in any television in the West, about homelessness, about hungry? People die of no food, even in the United States, but you will never hear that, right? So the truth is that we need to start to show and actually work on actually developing our own narratives for our own people, educate them, and so that people start to see, rather than actually react and overreact and say, oh, this is not true. But say, okay, there is violence. Sure, there is violence. You can get mugged in Ethiopia. You can get mugged in New York. Just yesterday, 11 people were killed in California. Did you hear that on the news in Africa? You probably didn't. Somebody just went on a farm and randomly killed 11 people. Do you see that kind of violence in Africa? No, right? It's probably you're in a much more safer place than I am, but you would never hear that. You see, so to me, my thinking is that we need to start to figure out, how do we change the narrative? How do we control it? And it's your job as journalists to actually change that narrative and start talking it in a way that we can say, look, here there are things you can do on this continent.
Do you think that African countries have a strong media industry that can truly serve the interests of those countries?
I think there is. For instance, let's have a look there. They use the media and our political systems, for instance, right? The first thing they need to do is decolonize, decouple from the European narrative of about Africa as the darker continent, for instance, with no history before the arrival of the Europeans, right? We need to have that clear slate in which we can say, okay, we have an absolutely amazing. Africa is the only continent which has got a very dynamic young population, which is technologically savvy. Nobody believes that in the north, in the global north. But look at the usage of internet, of smartphones in Africa, how people are connecting with each other. I think this is our time. This is the opportunity in which the continent and the youth, young people in the media can actually completely change how the media on the continent works. We don't have to wait for Twitter. We don't have to wait for WhatsApp. There are a lot of other ways in which African, and I know in Ethiopia, you have upcoming media companies which are coming up with communication platforms. It's happening in Kenya, it's happening in Tanzania, it's happening in Burundi. So all of these places, it's happening in Rwanda, all these places, people are starting to communicate with each other in a way that never before we have actually seen that kind. And so to me, I look at Africa as like, that is gonna be the place in which we can basically get ourselves. There is so much creativity on the continent. given the meager resources which the continent have in terms of the technology, but the way that the continent has embraced the technology. And I think that that's the way. We are very good at telling our stories. Traditionally, we do that. Oral telling of stories. We do that, everybody. I'm sure when you are growing up, your grandparents will tell you stories. And those stories didn't just happen in a vacuum. These were stories which were like educational. There are stories about ethics. There are stories about behavior. The same, we can do that. We have all kinds. We have the music, we have the creative art industry, all of those. It's just a matter of tapping into that and using them successfully. And I think we'd be way ahead of everybody.
What is African integration and why is it important?
Okay. In 2050, Africa will have a population of about 1 billion people. Actually, 1.18 billion people, even more. Think about it. A 1.18 billion people on a continent. Imagine a continent which has got 60% of the population of the continent. It's youth, it's young population. And that young population is the workforce, is the future workforce. In all aspects, without the integration, we're not going to be able to move forward. We have the resources in terms of human capacity. We have the natural resources. It's just a matter of actually what you need to integrate is that you need to create a market of 1.8 billion people. That's a huge market. Let's use an example of China, for instance. I will use China as an example. 20 years ago, we didn't think about China will make it the way it is today. That's the second largest economy in the world. Maybe probably the first, who knows? We say the second because it's based on the European and the West's estimates of economic power and the resources. But I know here in the United States, for instance, China's, if actually pulls the plug, the US government bonds will collapse because China have invested in that, right? So think about it. Now, one may not necessarily think about this, but think about Africa. Africa in which Ghana produces, let's say Ghana will produce chocolate, not Switzerland. Ghana produces chocolate, made in Ghana, sold everywhere in Africa and sold everywhere in the world. Ethiopia produces coffee, the best coffee in the world, right? Processed and packaged, not sold as raw material, right? But sold everywhere. All the Starbucks of the world will have Ethiopian coffee. And think about it. We dictate the prices for the coffee. The farmers get that money. You start to think about it. Now, think about the minerals and all the other wealth we have. You guys can start producing electricity for countries like Kenya, Tanzania. You have these wonderful resources with hydroelectric power, which you have one of the largest on the continent, right? Think about it. You start to produce. So an integration, a really true integration, both economically and allowing movement of the people. The young people, you can be in Ethiopia, you can work in Kenya, you can work in Nigeria, you can have somebody from Nigeria work in Tanzania, work in all these places. You start to look at those talents, and then you start to think, okay, do we really need to bring Italians as expatriates? Do we need to bring Chinese as expatriates? No, but we have a youth, we have a talented African youth, which we haven't tapped in. It's only through the integration we dissolve those boundaries which were actually created by the Europeans in 1886, and they start saying Africa is a continent, we have a single currency, single passport, like the European Union, we will be the force to reckon with. We will be the second largest economy in the world. The global North knows that. They don't want it because they know if we have it, it's a threat. That's the truth. But we need to think about it. Are our leaders ready to do that? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because some people will start to think about their powers. Oh, I'm a president of Tanzania, I'm a president of Kenya, I'm a president of Ethiopia, I'm a president of Nigeria. But our founders on the African movement, that meeting which happened in Ethiopia, which actually created the Organization of African Union, if we went back then, if we would have gone with that one single Africa, today we wouldn't be having these problems we are talking about. Everybody knows that. But the biggest question, is there the will for us to actually sort of really become an integrated one Africa, single currency, single passport? There is no reason for you to be asking to go to Tanzania and get a visa to go to Tanzania, in which you're given, for instance, so much conditions. Somebody from Russia, somebody from Ukraine, will just come and get a stamp because they're white. Black on black. I mean, we are discriminating each other. We as Africans, we are discriminating each other. And that's very sad to think about, because these are things should not be happening, but they are happening. When do we get rid of those kind of colonial legacy sort of attitude, which actually has been implanted in our institutions? So yes, we need an African integration, and that's the only way we can actually move forward.
So what works did African leaders and organizations in Africa do so far to integrate African countries?
I mean, yes, there are some efforts. There are various efforts which have been put forward. We have ECOWAS in West Africa. We have the Eastern African Community. We have the Southern SADC. But all of these, they are still blocks, right? You need an entire Organization of Africa in which you get an African Union. I mean, interesting enough, I'm talking to you, you're sitting in Addis, and Addis is actually the headquarters of the African Union. Why can't we push from there and say, okay, we have had this for over 60 years. We know it hasn't really worked very well. Now let's think about it. We are actually gonna expand it, the so-called the Africa We Dream, the Africa We Dreams sort of strategy. What is it? 2063. Sorry, 2063. We are not going to realize it unless these different blocks which we already have in existence in West Africa, those several countries uniting, in Eastern Africa and in Southern Africa and the northern part of Africa, we need to have one single union. We need in which that really brings us together. I mean, there is a saying, united we stand, we conquer. If we don't stand united, we are going to actually sort of remain the way we have been for the last 60 years. It's very easy. It's very easy to deal with. So here's I'll tell you an example. Within East Africa, several years ago, within Eastern African countries, the European Union wanted to do a bilateral agreement with the Eastern African bloc. Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda had a different opinion. and they didn't want to sign that agreement, Kenya went ahead and signed the agreement. That agreement weakened the Eastern Africa as a bloc. You see, can you imagine if you have one single negotiating power as an African continent, in which you can say, okay, you want to deal with the United States, you want to deal with China, and say, no, this is our terms, this is our conditions as a collective entity, as an African Union. So if you do that, I think everybody would know. You become much more powerful. You have the negotiating power to do a lot of that. Right now, we don't. But I mean, we are starting, and I'm hoping that maybe in the next 10, 15 years, when people like you continue asking these questions and asking why aren't we united, maybe that message finally will hit home and people will start to say, wait a minute, 60 years, 63 years, we still haven't united. What's wrong with us, right? So I think that it would work. Yeah. So it's your duty as the young generation to actually keep probing and asking these questions. I think they're very, very important. They should remind us. I'm sure a lot of the young generation don't know about the Nkrumahs, the Haile Selassies, who actually started the African Union, which we call today African Union, the Organization of African OAU, right? Way back. And that those meetings which happened in Addis and in Ghana and in Liberia back then, they were key. They were very important. Back then, there were still two factions. There was one area, one group saying no. There's another group saying we need to do this. But they were actually being brought together by the Nkrumahs, by the Haile Selassies, by the Nyereres, right? Back then. We need to have another generation of young people and people like you who are asking those questions. And people are like start saying, wait a minute, why haven't we been able to do so? We've been talking about this for the last 63 years, and still we haven't reached anywhere.
How can economic ties help African unity, and what role does it have in politics?
There is one segment of the African population which has actually been not really thought about, and that's the Africans in diaspora. Imagine let's think about it. Imagine all the Ethiopians who live outside of Ethiopia, right? There are millions of Ethiopians who live outside of Ethiopia. And one thing what they do, almost every one of them, including myself as a Tanzanian, we send money home, right? We send money home to help families. We send money home to help with education and all that. Now think about it. If this group, which is big, right? But again, it's been divided. You got Ethiopians in diaspora, you got Kenyans, you got Tanzanians. But if collectively you actually you bring this group together, right? And imagine the power they would have, the economic power, because they have access to resources in the global north. A best example would be North Ireland, right? Ireland in the 1990s, it was struggling economically in Europe. But the Irish people, both in the US, in Canada, in Australia, they got their acts together and start sending money, investing in Ireland. Within 10, 15 years, the Irish economy was one of the best within the European Union. So think about it. If you tap into the African diaspora, right? And it could be, I may be interested, for instance, to say, I may love Ethiopia and I may want to invest, right? Think about it. But we are not thinking about this in terms of the African diaspora in general, both in Europe, in North America, in the Caribbean, all of that. If we start to tap into that and actually sort of encourage it to bring resources, to invest on the continent, the talents and all that. Let me give you an example. I live in Colorado, right? One of my senators, a representative, is of Ethiopian origin, Mr. Negusi. He sits on some of the biggest, the most important committees in the Senate in the United States. We tap into that kind of resources and influences. There's a lady in Minnesota, who is also another member of Senate of Somalian descent, right? I mean, this is just a few examples I'm giving you. They are doctors, they are engineers, all of that. We start to tap into that. I mean, I know Ethiopia has done that, but think if we do it at the continent, at the level of the continent, the amount of resources which can actually be brought back to the continent, it would be amazing. Today, Africa is the place where everybody takes the resources out, including the brain, right? But think about it. If you start bringing it back in one or another way, that would be very interesting. So the people in the diaspora, would it be they're interested to actually start to do that. But we need to get, as the continent and African governments need to start to recognize that and actually start utilizing, taking advantage of these kind of resources. Now, the Global North understands that there is a huge of highly educated workforce of African origin, for instance. If they all focus their energy to the continent, then this would be the raising of the African phoenix. I call it the African phoenix because Ethiopia is starting to do it. All the other African countries can do it. Rwanda is doing it. Kenya is starting to do it. And we are all borrowing and learning from each other. And now think about if the entire continent does that. Can you imagine how much that will mean to the continent in terms of economic power, in terms of the technological power? We have physicists here of Ethiopian origins working in some of the highly prestigious national laboratories in the US. Can you imagine if there was a national laboratory in Africa? Let alone we have biotechnology sort of engineers, right, of African origin. Imagine if we brought it. The good example I can tell you, most of the people working in the medical research in vaccines, for instance, the majority of them are of African origins. Many. I know a couple of people, and you ask them the question, could we have developed a COVID vaccine in Africa? The answer is yes. If African countries could have tapped into it, if there was the infrastructure. I mean, I know now there is a global CDC sort of center which is actually in Ethiopia for the African continent. Now, can you imagine if you bring those scientists together? We could start working on some of the most disease which have plagued the continent for years. Malaria, tuberculosis, you name it. We could be working on that. The global north is not interested in malaria research because there are very few people in the global north who die from that disease. But it's a disease which, for instance, is killing a lot of people. But if you have that resources, you're bringing that resources, the young people who are doing all this biotechnology sort of sciences, physicists, you name it. I mean, you bring all those back to the continent. And you tell them, here's the resources. Please build our continent. People will do that. But why aren't we tapping into that? The answer is that we still have government systems in which, and I would say this because it happened to me, we still have government systems in which individuals, rather than think about collectively about the population, about the country, they think about themselves. They are there to make sure, oh, if that individual comes, I may lose my job. That's trivial to me. Because look, I'm here sitting on the board, for instance, as an example, sitting on a board of the US World Heritage organizations, one of the biggest World Heritage organizations in the entire continent. That's sort of global, I would say, not the entire world, in which they're the ones who have been dictating about what means when you say we have you have a site in Ethiopia like Mecca Kunture, it's a World Heritage site. Now, when you think about it, people decided on this side. It's not we as Africans deciding it, but we need to start to think about how do we bring this group of people. I have my colleagues I work with at various places, right? I have Dr. Haile Selassie at Arizona State University. I had Zerai Alemzeged at University of Chicago, talented Ethiopian, wonderful, perfect, I mean, great scientists, right? Think about it. We are struggling with all kinds of things in Africa. We could actually be bringing these kind of people. This is just to name a few people, right? But we are not necessarily doing that. And I think that's another area in which we are missing. Right? We are missing tremendously. The Chinese have done so well. The Chinese send their people to study in Australia, in Europe, in the United States. And those people went back. The Chinese government said, please come back. Please come back. Huh? We'll give you the resource to do that. You know what they have done? Wonders. What is it stopping us from doing the same? And I think this is the question you guys, especially in the media and the young people on the continent, can start asking those questions. They say, why aren't we bringing back these people to come and help us? And I think you have that obligations as a investigative journalist to say, China did this. Why is Africa not doing the same? Ireland did that. Why Africa is not doing the same? And there are so many countries which have done that. Brazil did that and all that. So I think we are at a time in which we need to start to think about tapping into that kind of resource. And then the other thing too, is the young generation, is the youth in Africa. We need to give them the tools. We need to give them the tools. They are so creative, but they don't have the tools to advance those creativity. And so there is a need to actually push for that resources for them to become creative. Young people should not be heavily relying on getting employment in the government. They can start their own entrepreneur sort of incubation hubs and actually start take those ideas into actually sort of research and development, and then actually sort of really spring them out to actually start doing things. So I think these are some of the things which we need to start to think as a continent.